Kim Min-Jae had erased Nia from his life with a single stroke of a fountain pen. He had forced her to sign those divorce papers in a room filled with the cold scent of expensive cologne and unspoken threats, casting her out into the world with nothing but her shattered dignity. He believed her a traitor, a stain on the Kim syndicate's honor. 3 years of silence followed. 3 years where he convinced himself that his heart was as bulletproof as his armored car. But 3 years later, in the dim light of his private office, the ghost he had buried came back to haunt him. It wasn't in a dream or a dark alley, but on a 70-inch television screen broadcasting a live gala for a new international humanitarian foundation. The camera panned across the crowd and settled on a woman in a deep red dress, Nia. She wasn't the trembling girl he had exiled. She stood with a spine of steel, radiant and untouchable. And standing beside her, holding her hand with a serious, observant expression, was a young boy. A boy with Min-Jae's exact jawline, his brooding eyes, and the unmistakable mark of the Kim lineage. In that moment, the ruthless king of the Seoul underworld felt something he hadn't felt in a decade: absolute, paralyzing shock. Before we dive deeper into this revelation, I want to welcome you back to the channel. Drop a comment below and let me know which city you are watching from. I love seeing our global family grow. If you're ready to see a powerful man realize he's been his own worst enemy, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss a single second of what happens next. Kim Min-Jae did not flinch when a rival's blade grazed his neck. He did not blink when a multi-billion-won deal went south. His entire existence was a monument to discipline, calculation, and a silence that terrified his enemies. Yet, as the news anchor praised the foundation's new patron, Min-Jae's hand tightened around his glass of scotch until the crystal groaned. On the screen, Nia was smiling, but her eyes remained guarded, the same way they looked when she used to hide her pain from him. Then, the camera zoomed in on the child, Kim Woo. The boy adjusted his tiny tuxedo jacket with a gesture so identical to Min-Jae's own habits that it felt like a physical blow to the chest. "Boss?" his advisor, Park, whispered from the corner of the room, holding a stack of merger documents. "The shipping lanes in Busan, are you listening?" Min-Jae didn't turn. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the boy, his mini-me. "Get the car," Min-Jae commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Sir? We have the board meeting in 10 minutes. Min-Jae finally turned, and the look in his eyes made Park take a step back. It wasn't the look of a businessman or a mobster. It was the look of a predator who had just realized he had been hunting the wrong prey for 3 years. "Find out where that gala is being held," Min-Jae said, grabbing his jacket. "And find out who gave her the right to keep my son a secret." He was already moving toward the door, not with his usual calculated pace, but with a predatory urgency. Nia had returned, and this time, no amount of signed papers could keep the truth away. The smell of burning cedar in his office tonight was the same as it had been 3 years ago, but the warmth offered no comfort. Min-Jae leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes fixed on the now dark television screen, but his mind was elsewhere. He was back in that cold, cavernous room at the Kim estate. He could still see Nia standing there, her red dress a sharp contrast to the gray stone walls and the black suits of the men flanking the exits. He remembered the way his own voice had sounded that night, hollow, like a ghost's. He had tossed a thick folder onto the mahogany table. It contained photos, doctored bank statements, and a testimony from his most trusted lieutenant, all pointing to a single conclusion: Nia was feeding information to the Seoul District Prosecutor's office. He hadn't asked for her side of the story. In his world, suspicion was a death sentence, and the fact that he was letting her live was, in his mind, the ultimate act of mercy. "Sign it," he had commanded. His face had been a mask of stone, though his chest felt like it was being crushed by a vice. Nia had looked at the papers, then up at him. Her eyes weren't filled with the guilt he expected, but with a devastating, quiet shock. She had reached for his hand, but he had stepped back, retreating into the shadows of his own making. "You have 10 minutes to sign and 1 hour to leave the country," he had told her. "If I see you in Korea again, I won't be this kind." With trembling fingers, she had picked up the pen. The scratch of the nib against the paper had sounded like a scream in the silent room. She didn't say a word as she finished. She simply stood up, her long straight hair falling over her shoulders, and walked past him. As she reached the door, she paused, her hand on the frame. "I never betrayed you, Min-Jae," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "One day, you'll realize the person who destroyed us is still standing right behind you." Back in the present, Min-Jae's grip on his scotch glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. For 3 years, he had lived with the conviction that he had done what was necessary for the syndicate. He had replaced her with work, with violence, and with a cold, hollow discipline. But the boy on the screen, Kim Woo, was a living contradiction to everything he believed. The boy was 3 years old. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. Nia hadn't left alone. She had carried his legacy into the dark, and he had been the one to push her there. The obsession that had begun the moment he saw her on the news was now a raging fire. He wasn't just looking for a former wife, he was looking for a part of his own soul that he had discarded. The black sedan moved through the neon-soaked streets of Seoul like a predator in the night. Inside, the only light came from the glowing tablet held by Park, who was scrolling through encrypted files with a frantic precision. Min-Jae sat in the shadows of the back seat, his gaze fixed on the passing city, his mind a storm of cold fury and rising desperation. He had spent 3 years believing he had scrubbed Nia from the earth, but the data flooding in suggested she had never truly left, she had simply evolved. "We tracked the broadcast signal and the Foundation's registration, boss," Park said, his voice tight. "The organization is called the Azure Shield. On paper, it's a high-profile humanitarian group focused on maternal health and education. But the financing, it's unusual." Min-Jae didn't blink. "Explain." "The money isn't coming from the usual charitable circles. It's being funneled through the Choi Group." Min-Jae's jaw tightened. The Choi Group wasn't just a corporate entity, it was a behemoth that sat on the razor's edge of legality, often acting as the legitimate face for some of the most powerful families in East Asia. If Nia was under their umbrella, it meant she wasn't just hiding, she was being shielded by a power that didn't fear the Kim syndicate. "There's more," Park continued, tapping the screen to bring up a grainy surveillance photo taken only an hour ago near the gala's private exit. "She's staying at a high-security residence in the Songbukdong district. The security detail isn't standard corporate muscle. Those are elite contractors, possibly ex-special forces. They aren't just there to keep the paparazzi away. They're there to keep us out." Min-Jae looked at the image of the sprawling estate. He saw Nia stepping into a silver SUV, her movements fluid and confident. She was no longer the woman who had walked out of his office with nothing but a broken heart. She moved like someone who knew her worth, and her power. "And the boy?" Min-Jae asked, the words feeling like glass in his throat. "Kim Woo is enrolled in a private academy under the Choi Group's direct sponsorship," Park replied. "He's listed as the son of a high-ranking executive to keep his profile low, but his protection is even tighter than hers. They know who he is, boss. Or at least, they know who his father is." The realization settled in Min-Jae's gut like lead. Nia hadn't just survived his betrayal, she had built a fortress. She had sought out the one entity capable of standing against him and had used it to hide his own son in plain sight. As the car pulled up to the heavy gates of his own compound, Min-Jae realized that the investigation was no longer about finding a missing woman. It was a declaration of war. Nia had found a new protector, and Min-Jae would have to burn down the very world he built to get through to her. The chandelier light in the grand ballroom of the Latte Hotel felt aggressive, shattering against the crystal glasses and diamond necklaces of Seoul's elite. Min-Jae moved through the crowd like a ghost through a graveyard, his presence parting the sea of socialites and politicians. He didn't care for the pleasantries or the whispered rumors about his sudden appearance. His eyes were locked on the woman standing at the center of a circle of investors, Nia. She was even more breathtaking up close. Her skin glowed against the deep crimson of her gown, and her laughter was melodic, yet it carried a sharp, professional edge he didn't recognize. As he approached, the air around them seemed to drop in temperature. The investors, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere, offered hurried excuses and vanished, leaving the two of them alone in a bubble of suffocating tension. Nia, he said. The name felt like a prayer and a confession all at once. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She slowly turned, holding a flute of champagne with a steady hand. Her gaze met his, not with the fear of the girl he had banished, but with the chilling indifference of a stranger. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any tremor. "Do we have an appointment? Or are you a donor for the foundation?" The dismissal stung more than any physical blow. Min-Jae stepped closer, encroaching on her personal space, his shadow falling over her. "Stop the games. I saw him, Nia. I saw the boy on the broadcast. Kim Woo." A flicker of something passed through her eyes, not guilt, but a fierce, protective instinct. It was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by a polite, distant smile. "You must be mistaken. My son's name is Woo, yes, but he has nothing to do with you or the name Kim. There are many children who share a likeness with strangers. It's a common trick of the light." "A trick of the light?" Min-Jae's voice dropped to a dangerous, low vibrate. "He has my eyes. He has the gesture I make when I'm thinking. He is 3 years old, Nia. Don't lie to me." Nia set her glass down on a passing waiter's tray and leaned in, her perfume, something dark and floral, filling his senses. 3 years ago, Kim Min-Jae, you told me that if you ever saw me in Korea again, you wouldn't be kind. You made it very clear that I no longer existed to you." She straightened her posture, looking him dead in the eye. "I simply took you at your word. To me, and to my son, you are a ghost. And ghosts don't have heirs." Before he could reach for her arm, a tall, well-built man in a charcoal suit appeared at her side, placing a protective hand on the small of her back. It was one of the Choi Group's elite guards, but the way Nia leaned into him suggested a deeper level of trust. "Is there a problem here, Nia?" the man asked, his eyes fixed on Min-Jae with a challenge. "None at all," Nia replied, her voice cold as ice. "This gentleman was just leaving. He mistook me for someone he used to know." She turned her back on him then, walking away into the glittering crowd without a single backward glance, leaving Min-Jae standing in the middle of the ballroom, a king in a kingdom that suddenly meant nothing without the family he had thrown away. The silence of Min-Jae's private study was heavier than usual, the air thick with the scent of old paper and the bitter dregs of coffee. He sat at the center of a web of documents, the original evidence that had condemned Nia. For 3 years, he had treated this folder like a holy relic of her betrayal, a justification for the cold void in his chest. But tonight, the ink looked different under the harsh desk lamp. He picked up the primary piece of evidence, a series of encrypted transcripts allegedly showing Nia communicating with a rival syndicate. At the time, his head of security, Lee Sang-hoon, had presented them with such grim certainty that Min-Jae hadn't questioned the source. But as he looked at the timestamps again, a cold realization began to crawl up his spine. The messages were sent during the week of their anniversary, a week they had spent in a secluded villa in Jeju, where Nia had barely touched her phone, and the local cell towers had been down for maintenance. Min-Jae's eyes narrowed. He began to cross-reference the signatures on the bank transfers. They were perfect, almost too perfect. They lacked the slight, habitual slant Nia always had when she was in a hurry. He realized then that he hadn't been looking at a betrayal, he had been looking at a masterpiece of forgery. A knock at the door broke his concentration. Sang-hoon entered, his face the same mask of loyalty he had worn for a decade. "The shipments from Busan are secured, boss. And about the woman, our men are ready to move if you want her removed from the city permanently." Min-Jae didn't look up, his fingers tracing the edge of a forged photo. "Tell me, Sang-hoon, do you remember the Jeju trip? 3 years ago?" The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat too long for a professional. "Of course, sir." "Why do you ask?" "Because these transcripts say Nia was in Seoul that week, meeting with the prosecutors," Min-Jae said, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes were like chips of ice. "I was there with her. She never left my sight. Which means someone lied to me. Someone went to a great deal of trouble to make sure I threw away the only person I ever trusted." The air in the room became electric with unspoken threat. Sang-hoon's posture didn't change, but his pupils dilated. In that moment, the shadow of doubt transformed into a blinding light of certainty. Nia hadn't been the mole. The mole was the man standing across from him, the man who had ascended to the role of second-in-command the very day Nia disappeared. "I'll look into the discrepancy immediately, sir," Sang-hoon said, his voice a shade too tight. "Do that," Min-Jae replied, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. As the door closed, Min-Jae felt a sickening wave of guilt wash over him. He had been a king who let a serpent whisper in his ear, and the price of his arrogance was 3 years of his son's life. The hunt was no longer just for Nia, it was for the truth that would likely destroy his entire empire. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the skyscrapers of Gangnam, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement as Nia walked toward her parked SUV. Kim-woo was strapped safely into his car seat, humming a quiet tune to himself, oblivious to the world. Nia felt that familiar prickle at the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched, but she didn't look back. She had learned that in this world, showing fear was an invitation to strike. She reached for the driver's side door when the air was suddenly shattered by the screech of tires. 2 black vans swerved around the corner, boxing her vehicle in with military precision. Before Nia could react, several masked men stepped out, their movements synchronized and cold. They weren't there for a conversation. They moved with the lethal intent of cleaners sent to erase a mistake. "Get in the car, Woo. Stay down." Nia hissed, her voice a mix of terror and steel. She reached into her handbag for the small, concealed firearm she had carried since the day she left the Kim estate, but the first man was already upon her. A gunshot rang out, but it didn't come from the attackers. From the shadows of a nearby parking pillar, a silver sedan roared to life, plowing directly into the side of one of the vans. 3 men in tactical gear emerged from the sedan, but they weren't wearing masks. They moved with the unmistakable, heavy-handed efficiency of Min-Jae's inner circle. At the lead was Park, his face set in a grim mask of determination. The parking garage erupted into a chaotic symphony of gunfire and breaking glass. Nia crouched by the SUV's tire, her body acting as a human shield for the door where Kim-woo sat. She watched in a daze as Min-Jae's men engaged the attackers. This wasn't a rival family hit, the attackers were using Kim's syndicate tactics. These were Sang-hoon's men, the traitors within Min-Jae's own house. Suddenly, a heavy hand grabbed Nia's shoulder, pulling her back. She spun around, ready to strike, but her breath caught. It was Min-Jae. His suit jacket was discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and his eyes were wild with a protective rage she had never seen before. He didn't look at her, his gaze was locked on the SUV. Is he safe? Min-Jae roared over the sound of a shattering windshield. Stay away from him. Nia screamed, even as he shoved her behind the safety of a concrete pillar, using his own body to block the line of fire. Min-Jae didn't argue. He drew his weapon and fired 2 precise shots, dropping a man who had been advancing on the SUV with a canister of gasoline. The realization hit Nia like a physical blow. These people weren't trying to kidnap the boy. They were trying to kill the only legitimate heir to the Kim throne before Min-Jae could claim him. In the eyes of the syndicate, a secret son was a liability that needed to be liquidated. They won't touch him, Min-Jae growled, his voice vibrating with a promise of absolute violence. Not as long as I'm drawing breath. The sterile white envelope sat on Min-Jae's desk like an unexploded bomb. He had obtained the samples during the chaos of the garage ambush, a stray hair from Kim Woo's jacket, a smudge of DNA from the boy's discarded juice box. He hadn't used the syndicate's labs for this. He couldn't trust them. Instead, he had sent the samples to an independent facility under a pseudonym, paying in untraceable cash. The silence in the room was absolute, yet Min-Jae felt a deafening roar in his ears. His fingers, which had never trembled while holding a weapon, shook as he slid the letter opener through the seal. He pulled out the single sheet of paper. His eyes skipped past the complex genetic markers and the scientific jargon, searching for the only number that mattered. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The paper fluttered from his hand, settling on the floor. Min-Jae closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia king felt the heavy crown of his empire shatter. The logic he had lived by, the discipline of discarding anything that showed weakness, had led him to discard his own flesh and blood. He had spent 3 years obsessed with loyalty and betrayal, only to realize that he was the greatest traitor of all. He had betrayed the woman who loved him, and he had abandoned the son who carried his face. Every luxury in this room, every drop of blood spilled to maintain the Kim name, suddenly felt repulsive. The leather chairs, the silk curtains, the armored walls, they weren't symbols of power, they were the bars of a cage he had built for himself. He thought of Kim Woo's serious, observant eyes. Those were the eyes of a child who had grown up without a father because that father was too busy being a monster. A quiet rage began to replace the shock. It was a cold, focused fury directed at the world he had cultivated. He realized that as long as he remained at the head of the syndicate, Kim Woo would never be safe. The boy would always be a target, a piece on a chessboard, or a liability to be removed by men like Sang-hoon. Min-Jae stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't reach for his ledger or his phone to call for an update on the docs. Instead, he walked to the wall safe and pulled out a clean, blank passport and a stack of documents that represented his private, untainted wealth. His loyalty to the criminal life was gone, burned away by the ink on that DNA report. He was no longer a boss. He was a father who had a debt to pay, and he would burn the Kim syndicate to the ground if that was what it took to buy back the 3 years he had stolen from his son. The air in the syndicate's subterranean boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the electric hum of hidden tension. Sang-hoon sat at the foot of the long mahogany table, surrounded by the senior lieutenants who had helped Min-Jae expand his empire through blood and iron. They were celebrating the success of the recent skirmish, spinning a narrative of rival interference, unaware that the predator they served was already standing in the doorway, watching them through the glass. When Min-Jae entered, the room went bone-chillingly silent. He didn't sit. He walked to the head of the table and tossed the DNA report and the original betrayal folder onto the polished wood. The impact sounded like a gunshot. 3 years, Min-Jae began, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the pens on the table. For 3 years, I believed I was the one pulling the strings. I believed I was the architect of this family's future. He looked directly at Sang-hoon, whose face remained a disciplined mask, though a single bead of sweat tracked down his temple. But I was just a pawn. A blind, arrogant fool who let a snake build a nest in his own house. Sang-hoon cleared his throat, his voice steady but thin. Boss, if this is about the woman, we were only trying to protect the lineage from. Protect? Min-Jae interrupted, his hands slamming onto the table with a violence that made the lieutenants flinch. You forged evidence to exile my wife. You intercepted her letters. And when you realized she had given me a son, an heir you couldn't control, you tried to erase him from the earth. Min-Jae leaned over the table, his face inches from Sang-hoon's. The absolute lack of emotion in his eyes was more terrifying than any scream. You didn't do this for the syndicate. You did this because a man with a family is harder to manipulate than a man with a hole in his chest. You wanted a monster for a boss so you could play king in the shadows. One by one, the men around the table looked away, unable to meet Min-Jae's gaze. They saw the shift. The man standing before them was no longer the calculated CEO of crime, he was a father who had seen the bottom of the abyss. This is your final warning, Min-Jae whispered, the threat carrying more weight than 1,000 shouted orders. I am dismantling the security protocols for the northern docks and the Busan routes tonight. They are yours to fight over. But if any of you, or any man you hire, so much as looks in the direction of Nia or my son again, I won't just kill you. I will erase every trace that you ever existed. I am leaving this life, but I am taking the fire with me. He turned on his heel, leaving the men to their crumbling empire. He had spent his life building a fortress of fear, only to realize the real war was just beginning, and he would have to fight it without his crown. The transition from being a king to a target began with the stroke of a pen, but this time, the ink was not a weapon of betrayal, it was a shield for those he loved. Min-Jae sat in his high-rise office for the last time, the city of Seoul sprawling beneath him like a glowing circuit board he no longer wished to power. On the desk lay the legal transfers of his most lucrative, and most dangerous, assets. By morning, the shipping lanes, the private security firms, and the shadow accounts would belong to a coalition of his rivals. It was the ultimate blood price. To ensure that no man in the underworld would ever have a reason to hunt Kim Woo, Min-Jae had to render himself powerless. He was trading his throne for his family's anonymity. Are you sure about this, boss? Park asked, standing by the door with a look of profound grief. You're giving them everything. Without the syndicate's protection, you'll just be a man with a name and a target on your back. I was already a man with a target, Min-Jae replied, not looking up as he signed the final document. The difference is that now, I'm the only one standing in the line of fire. If I keep this chair, Wu becomes the next generation of this poison. If I leave it, he gets to be whatever he wants. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. He knew that by surrendering his empire, he was inviting every vengeful soul he had ever crossed to come looking for him. But he also knew Nia. He knew she would never let a mafia boss into her son's life. She would only let in a man who had proven he valued them more than his own life. The sacrifice felt heavy, a physical weight on his shoulders, yet as he watched the sun begin to rise over the Han River, he felt a strange, light sensation in his chest. He was dismantling the Kim legacy, brick by bloody brick. He called the head of the Choi group, Nia's protector, and gave them the encryption keys to his private servers, a final gesture of surrender that would ensure Nia's foundation remained untouchable. "It's done," Min-Jae whispered into the empty room. He left his jacket on the back of the chair and his gun in the top drawer. He walked out of the building alone, without a motorcade, without a guard, and without a title. For the first time in 15 years, Kim Min-Jae was just a man. He hailed a regular taxi, giving the driver the address of the modest park where Nia often took Woo in the mornings. He had lost his world, but as the car pulled away, he realized he was finally on his way to find his home. The morning mist was still clinging to the grass when Min-Jae found them. In the quiet corner of a neighborhood park, far from the gilded cages of Gangnam, Nia sat on a colorful play mat while Kim Woo chased a rogue soccer ball. Min-Jae stopped several yards away. He didn't approach with the heavy footsteps of a man who owned the city. He stood still, a solitary figure in a plain navy sweater, looking more vulnerable than he ever had in a tailored suit. Nia saw him first. Her body tensed instinctively, her eyes darting to find her son. But as she studied Min-Jae, she saw the change. The cold, predatory stillness was gone, replaced by a weary, humble patience. He didn't move toward her. He simply waited. Eventually, Kim Woo's ball rolled toward Min-Jae's shoes. The boy stopped, looking up at the man who shared his face with a curious, unblinking stare. Min-Jae slowly knelt on the grass, bringing himself down to the child's level. He didn't reach out to grab him or claim him. He simply picked up the ball and held it out with a steady hand. "Min-Jae," Nia said, walking over. Her voice wasn't cold anymore, but it wasn't warm either. It was cautious, a bridge built on unstable ground. "I've settled everything," he said, his voice low so as not to startle the boy. "The syndicate, the business, the men who hurt you, they're gone. I have nothing left but what I've saved for Woo's future. I'm not here to take him, Nia. I'm not here to demand anything." Nia looked at him, searching for the shadow of the man who had forced her to sign those papers 3 years ago. She found only a man who looked like he had finally woken up from a long, violent nightmare. "What are you here for, then?" "To be a father," he replied, his gaze shifting to Kim Woo, who had taken the ball and was now inspecting Min-Jae's watch. "And to earn the right to stand in your shadow. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness today. I might not deserve it in 10 years. But I'll wait." Nia was silent for a long time, the only sound the distant chirping of birds and the rhythmic thud of the ball. She knew the danger he had come from, and she knew the sacrifice he had made to walk away. She wasn't ready to love him again, the wounds were too deep for a single morning to heal, but as she watched Kim Woo offer Min-Jae a small, plastic toy dinosaur, she felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. "We come here every Tuesday at 10, she said softly, turning to walk back to the mat. She didn't invite him to follow, but she didn't tell him to leave. Min-Jae watched her go, a lump forming in his throat. It was a small beginning, a tiny crack in the wall he had built between them, but for a man who had lost everything, it was the greatest empire he had ever owned. He sat down on the grass, content to simply watch his son play, knowing the road back would be long, but for the first time in his life, he was finally walking in the right direction. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.